is the first lecture of the spring semester. Patrik Schumacher is with us. Before I read his bio, what can I say? I know Patrik for years. He's a unique architect, innovator, breed. Traditionally, there's been a division between theory and practice. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's inevitable that one who chooses to go in this profession will pursue an area of interest, and depending on their ambition and their curiosity, they will either stay within one arena or begin to transgress it and unify a number of them. Patrik, who is the partner with Zaha Hadid, has produced some of the most spectacular buildings, I think, in the last 25 years, contemporary buildings. Some of them have been game changers insofar as they have been radical, they have been controversial, they have created a certain polemical dissent in our profession, which I think is a good thing. If I'm reminded of Frank Gehry's project in Bilbao, and actually how a project like that was capable of changing the history of architecture. I think that the work that's come out of Patrik and Zaha's office has done that many times over. And it's not just about making beautiful buildings, and certainly many of them are extraordinary buildings. But I see them as these fantastic kind of didactic grenades that emanate well beyond the site, and they change the public space. They increase awareness about the power of architecture. They set up a dialectic with traditional architecture in a beautiful way. There's a conversation in many of the projects in terms of how they nest themselves into existing cities. The work is in the forefront in terms of not only its theoretical ambition, but in terms of certain technological innovations that have had to be conquered and overcome in the context of putting this in the work. It's very rare that you will find someone who has a kind of seamless practice in terms of their theoretical position and the physical manifestation of the work. That's a compliment on the highest level. In terms of some of the facts, Patrik, as I mentioned, is a partner of Zaha Hadid Architects and a founding director at the AA Design Research Lab. He studied philosophy and architecture in Bonn, London, Stuttgart, where he received his diploma in architecture in 1990. In 1999, he completed his PhD at the Institute for Cultural Science, Klagenfurt University. He joined Zaha's office in 1988. In 1996, he founded the Design Research Laboratory with Red Steele at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. And I should add, I've been on many juries there and in Vienna, and the work has always been extraordinary and authentic. He continues to serve as one of his co-founders. He's co-taught a series of postgraduate option studios with Zaha at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Columbia University, and at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. If you've never met Zaha, and hopefully one day you will, she's quite complex, and that's an understatement. And for Patrik to be at that level of collaborative discourse, and I would say kind of creative ownership, is an affirmation, really, of his gifts, and that's in caps. In 2004, Patrik was named a tenured professor at the Institute for Experimental Architecture in Innsbruck University. He's currently a guest professor at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. A few more comments. There's a lot of great architects that I know that are obsessed, as Patrik is, with their work, but very territorial about their ideas and about their time. One of the things, aside from all the gifts that I've cited, I think is his generosity of spirit, not only to think continuously outside the box. It's not a matter of like, okay, let me position myself and distinguish my work and our work from our peers and competitors, but rather, where does architecture go next? And if you have the opportunity to meet someone like Patrik, which I'm honored to be a friend and colleague, you realize he's constantly evolving, and that's wonderful. And not only that, but he's been a great supporter of generations of young architects that have come out of schools around the world, which is quite beautiful. And finally, with all the things that he does, he still finds time to assess the current state of architecture with his most recent book, Autopoiesis of Architecture, Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 is a new framework for architecture, and I believe Volume 2 is coming out, a new agenda for architecture in the next 3 months. These things are bad as they make Rem Koolhaas's book look small. I think it's an amazing achievement, and it's credible testimony to the fact that he teaches, he builds, he lectures, he participates in ongoing conversations with people around the world, and he puts time away to write about his position. It's a great pleasure to have Patrik Schumacher with us tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks so much for this generous introduction to Evan, and thanks for inviting me to the school and to this wonderful space. I will give a rather dense lecture. We'll run at about an hour, perhaps in 10 minutes, and then we hope we have some time for questions and answers. It's a theoretical lecture to a large extent, but I start with a series of images demonstrating that I'm a practicing architect and designer, and that the theory is nothing but the attempt to explicate and guide practice. It doesn't have its own agenda, if you like. It's kind of subsidiary to practice and the continuous innovation of architecture. The lecture is not easy. I don't expect you to understand 100%. 50% will be okay. I think 100% of the lecture is mostly not worthwhile sitting through. I know that some, like Evan and Chris, will understand a little bit more. Also because they are history, I have a history with them. And the lecture is also about their work as much as about my work. It's in fact about the work of a whole generation, which has been developing a new paradigm for architecture, which I call the Parametric paradigm, and that aspires to be the new epochal style of the 21st century parametricism. Just to flick through some of those images of completed built works, and I'm later on showing a whole kind of series of further built works, not only showing built work, but it's just the tip of the iceberg of a design oeuvre which is expanding exponentially now since our firm grew from 4 people when I started to 400 where we are now. So it's very much also a collaborative effort, a kind of intense culture which feeds itself from the various schools we're teaching, and from a global discourse, this kind of grand conversion of efforts and creative efforts under the new parametric order, if you like. So what you've just seen, one kind of set of phrases which summarize this complex variegated order. I think that's what we're aiming for, because that's, I think, what contemporary society, which I refer to as post-Fordist network society, requires, which is quite different from a previous era of modernism, which were congenial to what I call Fordist mass society, or what the modernists thought of as the industrial age. So, architecture's task now is to organize and articulate the societal complexities of post-Fordist network society. Underlining that confident statement is an understanding of the societal function of architecture, which I put abstractly as innovative ordering and framing of communicative interaction. Because social life is primarily communication. All the activities are communicative activities. They become ever more diverse, ever more interconnected. Everything is networked with everything else. And it's again kind of very complex communication system which we need to structure, order. We need to gather, people need to find each other, to gather and get into constellation in all sorts of diverse and interesting and parametrically variable event scenarios and communication scenarios. And that only can take place in a kind of complex, well-ordered built environment, which is a kind of sorting machine for social processes. And in terms of the task of constructing that and evolving that sorting machine and building up to ever higher levels of complexity, intricacy, dynamism, I'm distinguishing the aspect of organization. I mean, simply the distribution in space, the spacing out and separating out and connecting back physically of the various institutions and social situations. But I think there's a second aspect to that, which is the aspect of articulation. Not only that it is objectively sorted and arranged and organized, but that it is articulated so that it becomes legible, that we can navigate this, that people gather and find each other, and that they're put into the mood and mode of particular communicative situations. That is the task of articulation. That is to do with appearance and appeal and the visual order through which society functions. It's not only an objective order. We're not just bodies in space, we are kind of sentient socialist being who operate the built environment as a system of signification, as a language. And that is very important. That has not been reflected explicitly, but now I think we've reached a point where we need to reflect this explicitly and turn this into an explicit project to develop built environment to the next level of civilization. And this articulation has two aspects. It has a phenomenological aspect to do with perception and perceptual tractability and conspicuity of various scenes, kind of perceptual tractability of complex scenes, and then the semiology aspect, building up that language and system of signification. These categories and terms are focus of volume 2 of my book. So we have these three projects. There's a certain hierarchy that organization in a sense comes first, but then you need to start worrying about its perceptual palpability and legibility, and then you need to think about how this, out of that you can construct a semiological project. So architecture's task and core competency has these three dimensions: organization, articulation, and signification. And again, we have the aspect of physical arrangements, gathering and separating, of articulating for cognitive, sentient beings, and then signification for us as socialized learning beings that navigate and act and communicate in space And institutions offer spaces as framing communications, and we read them and take them up as such. We attribute them not to the architects, we attribute them to the hosts and institutions. So a space like this is an offering to host a particular type of social interactions, like collection, and has a certain atmosphere, a certain character, a certain size, a certain constellation, which you attribute to the institution. And the institution communicates. It's broadcasting a whole host and series of such offerings and communicative setups, and hires architects to do it on the highest sophisticated, appropriate level. So again, in terms of these three projects, the design project has these dimensions, and I'm recently foregrounding the semiological project. It has not been looked at, explicitly worked on. I think every designer intuitively understands what he's doing in terms of participating and intervening in a kind of visual language. You worry about whether your museum looks like a museum, or does it look like an office building, which you would like to avoid? Does it look very contemporary? Does it look addressing a kind of more youthful audience, more avant-garde audience, or more kind of established set of institutions? So that we permanently, continuously navigating a kind of semantic and semiotic field, and I want to make it a kind of systematic, explicit project, and I do that first of all through academic research. And again, I just make tables like this where I say these are the three kind of projects, the task dimensions of architectural design, how it contributes to framing social communication as physical frame, as perceptual frame, and as communicative frame, as communication which offers itself. And like any communication, it's either accepted, you enter the territory, and therefore subject yourself to its rules and setups and settings, or you reject it, you move on or exit. So, and the engagement of users, either as physical bodies, as sentient beings, or socialized actors, in terms of communicative action. And that is, you can see also here, there's a kind of sense of hierarchy that on the lower, most evolved side of things is where society and its most sophisticated and evolved characteristics can be pushed to the next level. It's no longer possible to advance society by sorting people like cattle into the various arrangements. They need to kind of allow and trigger their own active navigation and communication capacity. And the system of signification as the most evolved competency of architectural design has these three functions: navigation, orientation, and immersion. It's also putting the audience or the participants in a particular mood and mode and preparedness for a particular style of communication through atmosphere, through arrangement and semiotics. So when I'm trying to deliver a refoundation of architectural semiology, saying refoundation because in the 70s there was the first attempt to make architecture speak. After the crisis of modernism, the monotony of kind of mass-produced urbanism, that became an issue. But the way it was tackled and worked with, rather than kind of simplistically as a kind of recycling of a series of historical cliches, was a one-line which not convincing, and a one-sided effort which kind of collapsed after a few years. And I'm for this on it, and I think the time wasn't right. But in the interim years, a powerful paradigm has evolved which expanded organizational capacity of architecture. And now I think the time is right, and build up a new technological capacities, ordering and organizing capacities, and now the time is right to re-inject this and re-reflect the dimension of architecture as a semiotic system. And in the first round, there was also the confusion that one thought of it as architecture should symbolize things out of its own kind of domain and be kind of speak about God and the world. And I'm saying architecture should about itself in terms of all the institutions and spaces and activities which are to be expected and understood to take place within it. So the meaning of a word already, that is Wittgenstein's insight, is its use, and the meaning of a space is its use. So the language of architecture only talks about the life processes which take place and are to be expected and found and recognized and take place within it. Perhaps also various status groups one might expect as well. And the axiom of kind of new architectural semiology is that we need to look at not individual items like columns and windows or certain textures and ornaments as individual communications. They are kind of raw material, sign radicals perhaps, but we need to recognize that the minimum unit of an architectural communication is a territory. That's what invites you into its communication, into its setup. That's what you might reject. That's what you have to buy into when you step into the territory. It is the equivalent of what in the spoken language is a sentence. Individual words have no meaning. I can say dog and you don't know, I'm not saying anything. So it is the equivalent of the sentence is the territory, and only territories of meaning, and we constitute and constructing territories with vocabulary and hopefully with a grammar which allows us to express a near infinite variety of meanings, activities, with a finite set of vocabularies, components, syntax. So only a territory is a full communication, something that calls for being either accepted or rejected. You accept the communication, you enter the territory and participate in the respective interaction scenario. You reject the communication, you do not enter or exit the territory. So the architectural sign is the territory, and the space-making elements, the space-characterizing elements, are the sign radicals which need to be brought under the spell of a grammar. And that is a conscious, creative project, which I said to myself and my students setting semiology project. And this is not going to have time to go through in detail. One of such student projects trying to build a vocabulary of organizing tropes, of distinguishing units of space and interaction and arraying them and differentiating morphologically and having a kind of spatial syntax to translate a university campus which comes with different schools, faculties, departments, different status groups, students, visitors, staff, teaching staff, various types of activities which complex enough to call for perhaps the effort of building system signification coherently. So there's a series of distinctions with respect to faceted versus creased versus smooth shells. There's a kind of whole algebra of shell, a kind of set theory of, first of all, distinctions of shell shapes as well, and then they're kind of in matrices combined with different morphological types we've developed, and we're creating a kind of, we're going through it quickly, a kind of systematically arrayed and distinguished repertoire of shell forms. Then there's a layer of grid shelling, of making porous, and this could carry another layer of meaning. And of course, when we go into these subsystems, it's also important to see that these signs and morphologies are not only arbitrary, they're arbitrary in what we select, but they have also kind of tectonic, structural, form-found logic behind them in terms of the shelling, the ribbing. So we talk about a tectonic repertoire of articulation, which isn't kind of arbitrary color coding, which uses the material logics, structural logics, environmental logics as medium to construct a systematic language of differentiating various types of spaces, characterizing spaces, in distinct and interesting ways, constructing these networks of similitude and contrast, and various ways and algebras of intersecting. Again, there's finding and proliferating systems used. There's this kind of idea also of nesting and intersecting and negative Boolean relationships, the kind of whole logic of set series integrated. This is kind of some glimpse of a project and what this kind of work might end up looking like, and you can also see that it's fully within the parametricist paradigm. It's just adding another layer of rigor in interpreting these systems of differentiation and correlation than we would usually have done more intuitively, more playfully, without instrumentalization to the same extent. The next stage in this project is in fact that the meanings, which are the activity scenarios, are not only to be kind of talked to in the design or written into the spaces in a kind of textual fashion, but that you can actually incorporate the layer of meaning, the domain of the signified, with these kind of agent-based occupational modeling strategies. So we're not using the intelligence of crowd simulation, not for the kind of engineering event of evacuating space, but functional crowds, which are scripted with respect to particular settings, and their behaviors could be responsive to particular semiotic clues. And that's the way we learn it. The capital slows down, it creates atmosphere, light conditions, so we can create agent-based actors and associate their behavior to the architectural features as if they have learned the language of our design. And that's the way we can actually build up and keep track of a plausible, complex semiotic system and speculate for the first time in the history of architecture in a nuanced and plausible way, but also in a very creative way, about patterns of communication and interaction in space, which we understand now quite differently from the modernist idea of a schedule of accommodation with a handful of stereotypical functions. So it's a new era where the whole category of function is also radically rethought, and as you can see, in congeniality with the way parametricism has rethought the category of form. And that's just beginning, so we Parametricism is the title, the name I have been giving a collective movement which has evolved for more than a decade. So it's a retrospective account, description. When we had a kind of celebration of 10 years of AADRL a few years ago, I was struck by the fact that after 10 years, and that's a long time in the history of architecture, if you like, we had maintained tenaciously the same kind of values, agendas, pursuits, desires, and ambitions that we had started with in 1996. We just kind of deepened the quest, we've skilled up, we have burdened the initially formal exercises with particular programs, with structural logics, performative logics. So we've really building up a cumulative research where I would say, rather than kind of starting afresh and questioning everything every second year, which was the condition of the 80s when I was in architecture school. I was coming in a school which was first kind of hardcore modernist. I learned and got into that, then it became kind of a high-tech version of modernism, then it was postmodernism, and then 2 years later minimalism came up, and then it was deconstructivism. And it seemed as if architecture was kind of all about catching up the latest trends and the kind of fashion of shifts and change. And here we were in London and also at the office, looking back, it's not only more 10 years, it was only 15 years of coherent, evolving project, and that means something. Think back at modernism, the whole of the 20s was this kind of stage of maturation, building up the confidence, radiating out, drawing more and more people into a collective project. That's what it felt like. The students, at that time we had already a few hundred students gone through our studio, over 200 went through our office, but it's a global movement and it deserved the name, and I came up with the name Parametric. Of course, people don't like to be labeled, they want to keep their options open, but the reality is that a whole generation has been working under principles which I try to define under the label, which are very abstract and open-ended, but radically different to distinguish from modernism or postmodernism. And the next point was that I felt more and more that this work has matured to the point where it can go out into the world to make some statements, as Evan said, manifesto projects, which radiate beyond their immediate surroundings. But some of these projects, they're already functioning well and delivering high-performance architecture in their surroundings, with their clients, and they already demonstrate that we're ready to deliver what I call global best practice. And the Old Quest of Architecture is an attempt to reflect what we're doing in the context of societal developments, but also in the context of the history of architecture and how the history of architecture and the history of the great styles has evolved together with societal innovations and developments. So, with these two phrases, I'm kind of now known for. If you Google my name, it comes up either Parametric or the Old Quest of Architecture. Is on the one hand a unified hegemonic style with hegemonic ambitions, guided and argued by unified theory. The unified theory is simply a theory which tries to draw together into a unified theoretical edifice a lot of partial theories, which usually an author is writing an essay, picking up a particular topic, formulating a position about a particular question, and then there's another second question he's writing about, or somebody else writes about, and so the discourse is fragmented into lots of different positions, essays, topics, questions. So the question one might have is, can one draw together into some kind of coherent approach answers to all those different questions? Can there be answered from a single coherent project? Because the world is a unified single process, so our theory must be a unified theory. You can't invent it out of nothing. Initially, a discourse will build up various partial theories, but the unified theory needs to be posed as a quest. And that's what I did, and I claim I've delivered. So you can look, I hope everybody's getting a copy, digging in, having a look, and then we can have a conversation about the comprehensiveness of the theory. So is there any questions I left out? I don't know any, but I'm sure in the dialogue I will be posed such questions. So I'm saying I'm answering all questions architecture needs to answer. And it's coherent. The way I'm answering this different question, I'm not kind of getting in my own way and continuously contradicting myself. So the challenges are, here we have the comprehensive, coherent, unified theory of the discipline. And that allows me, plus, also look at my website, there's about 70, 80 articles published, which is much easier to kind of generate these kind of 3,000, 4,000 word articles, because each time you have a partial view, and you don't have to necessarily worry about cohering that with other partial views you might have delivered a year earlier. And so, how I was able to do this, first first of all, there's a kind of framework you need to settle within. There's a certain theory of society you settle yourself in, a certain paradigm of thinking about society, that is communication theory. And that's just a kind of decision, very helpful way of an abstraction, how to look at society, and then how to look at architecture within society, to treat them as communications. And I think that is the way to look at a very potent and effective abstraction of the 21st century, because most of our lives are kind of dematerialized to the extent that it's all problems of communication we're facing. The bottleneck is always communication. Even if you see when you have physical issues like you're ill or you had an accident, immediately the questions of communication come to the forefront. Have you health insurance? Can you communicate with the doctor? Do you have friends, colleagues? Are you insured? Even if you want to project yourself across the globe to Australia, it's more the question, do I have money to buy a ticket? Will there be security checks? Will there be queues? So it's all communication problems which are critical issues for all of us. And production is also communicating with the raw world, communicating, and discussing, and designing, and thinking through all our material life process as a result itself in communication process. All problems are communication problems. That's why theory of society, including the theory of architecture, is to be neatly abstracted into communication theory. And I look back at architecture, I'm not just staring at the built environment, I'm saying architecture as a discipline and discourse which controls the built environment, needs to be analyzed. So I'm offering a discourse analysis of architecture as global self-determined system of communication. And it's a global communication system. So anything you do here, or somebody, or a student or an architect is doing in China or India or elsewhere in the world, Europe, is thrown onto the internet, and it's all kind of immediately available to everybody else. So everything communicates with everything else. Everything is relevant to everything else in terms of that continuous communication process, whether it's an essay, a rendering, a photo, a build work. It's a grand discourse, and that discourse sorts out the values and relevancy criteria, but in the end, out of that is selected the structures which determine the built environment. And so it's a discourse analysis to understand how, what are the categories in terms of argument, the values and methods and ways of working, ways of criticizing, which have evolved over centuries and keep evolving, and there's enormous respect to understand its rationality. If certain categories persist and succeed, they must be rational. So I'm delivering that kind of retrospective discourse analysis, and then I move prospective. Only somebody who's really deeply understanding what we achieving today, how it is achieved, and how the discourse and the intelligence and the collective wisdom of the discourse and discipline is able to achieve what it is achieving, can offer criticism and project to the next step. So in volume 2 I'm moving from the descriptive to the normative, to the speculative, calling for proposals of upgrading the disciplinary intelligence. This is just a list of partial theories which have been integrated in the comprehensive, coherent theoretical edifice, which is the theory of architectural edifices. So critically, to understand the societal function of architecture is not about putting a roof over our heads. That triviality has been delivered by the vernacular, it's delivered by builders, by engineers. Societal function of architecture is that continuously innovative ordering and structuring of communicative scenarios in ever more dense and complex arrangements, and keeping legibility and communicative tractability. So it's the framing of communicative interaction, what it's all about. And not putting a roof over our head and make sure it doesn't leak. We need to worry about the demarcation of architecture, how it is quite distinct from neighboring disciplines it often is confused with, and once was fused with, like art. Architecture is not one of the arts. It's not one next to painting, sculpture. to be looked at that would be fallacious. It is also quite sharply to distinguish from the engineering discipline. It's not another engineering effort. It's very distinct. And you know the culture is so distinct. We have a different cast of characters, different preoccupations, and criteria of success. But of course, we're closely collaborating with engineers and integrate their intelligence and constraints and turn them into these constraints into articulatory ordering and organizing communication projects. So these are important. There's a theory of the avant-garde, which is very important too, because the discipline needs to evolve and has evolved an avant-garde segment to have a domain of radical innovation and experimentation, while state-of-the-art delivery has to continue every day. You can't use the next airport as a field of experimentation. It's untenable. So because innovation is so fast, so rapid, so demanding, we need to separate out the whole discourse, sub-discourse. And that sub-discourse has finally evolved after 15 years, something which I think is now ready, but it took these 15 years. Now ready to go back and impact the built environment. And for the first time after the crisis of modernism, you can make a real impact, I believe, if we push parametricism into the mainstream. While the avant-garde continues and evolving and innovating within that grand paradigm, the next stages, subsidiary styles which are to come. So the architectural theory, that's important, must be embedded within this updated theory of society. So we need to understand the societal function of architecture, to understand how we fit in, what is the contribution to the evolution of the civilization. We need to have a kind of grasp on the fundamental order, logic, and dynamics of contemporary civilization and society. And of course, that is something we should not expect an architect to deliver. But what we can expect is that an ambitious architectural theorist is scanning the field of social theory and teasing out the most advanced offering and then make a proposition that architecture might tie itself to a particular description of society. I tried that for the first 10 years of my kind of conscious life as a young architect in the context of Marxism. But Marxism, I don't think is credible. It's a very, very comprehensive and coherent account, and has certainly made a huge contribution to the evolution of sociology and social theory and political economy, but is no longer the theory, I think, to tie to, not least because some of its conclusions have been refuted by history, if you like, and I've been reading and trying to understand philosophy and social theory for many years, and I found and propose that the writings and theoretical system of the German sociologist and philosopher Niklas Luhmann is the place where we might find the deepest and most thorough and congenial account of contemporary world society to tie into. Just as a hint, he has distinguished, he thinks of society no longer as a kind of stratified order, but as a kind of order where different specialized discourses have separated out and autonomously co-evolving, like politics, the law, the economy, science, education, health, philosophy, and art. There are different subsystems of society which have their own logic, own criteria of success, own categories, and their own self-regulating, self-propelling contribution in that network of co-evolving systems. And I'm saying that architecture design is such a subsystem, which is sui generis competencies, sort of categories and ways of working, its own medium has evolved, the medium of drawing and modeling. The economy is another system, has evolved its own communication medium, namely money. political system has evolved its own kind of medium, which is kind of administrative power. So this is a way I want to propose that architecture, together with the other design disciplines, which I tie into this discourse, which is industrial design, fashion design, interior design, furniture design, graphic design. That's all design. It's all about framing communication, because we're communicating not only through the spaces we seek out and invite us into, but also we dress up for a particular occasion. All products are interfaces of communication, as well as their physical functionality. And the designers of all disciplines are the experts of treating the world, of the totality of the world of artifacts, as a system of communication. So this design architecture is drawn together into one function system, quite separate from art, quite separate from engineering. And this discourse claims exclusive and universal competency concerning the built environment and the world of all artifacts as frames and interfaces of communicative interaction. So the discourse which we are collectively constructing is at places like this, the AA, the GSD, some key publications, some key conferences and so on. That's the needle's eye, which determines the totality of world material production. The totality of the built environment, the totality of the world of artifacts depends on this discourse. And that was already in the 20th century. If you look back, the Bauhaus, what it kind of was created there, was discussed there and fought through in a theoretical discourse, in an experimental design environment, was then rolled out and determined the totality of the built physiognomy of 20th century, the world over, including all design elements. Everything is ultimately Bauhaus. We're sitting in a Bauhaus environment, we're using Bauhaus all over. And I'm saying it's ready for the next cycle of innovation. But that's you see the power of these discourses and how they kind of, in a competitive environment, kind of convergence, the market theories, and then the rollout. And just a hint, I will not spend too much time, how architecture is analyzed in a comparative matrix with all the other function systems, which have also evolved their own unique discourse and interest. Like the legal system with its own kind of set of categories and distinctions, and jurisprudence with its theoretical substream. Each of them have their own kind of lead distinction. They have the binary evaluative codes. For us, it's the double code of utility and beauty. For the sciences, it's truth versus false, probable versus improbable. The lead distinctions, form versus function, that's architecture. Theory versus evidence is the sciences. Norm versus fact is the legal system. These kind of these critical binary distinctions which unfold and demarcate the totality of a discourse. All of architecture is about giving form to function. All of science is giving evidence to theory, or theorizing evidence. All of the legal systems about norming facts and seeing if facts follow certain norms. So you can have these kind of levers which unfold these autocratic systems. So again, most important is to understand what is the societal function of architecture in that whole matrix of social discourses. And the societal function of architecture is the innovative ordering and framing of communicative interaction. And I sometimes give you the following thought experiment. How would society exist if there wasn't a kind of integrally structured built environment? Imagine a city like Manhattan, 5 million. The population of Manhattan, rolled out on a kind of undifferentiated tarmac surface. And it's clear that the experiment shows you that nobody would know who they are anymore, what they're supposed to do, what's next. So there's a whole kind of, it will be the wiping out of the kind of intricate, cumulatively built up, complex social memory and information processing machine. That's what architecture delivers. And without that, no society is possible. not even the most primitive society could have been possible without clinging to and building up its social relations and complexity through accumulating a complex, ever more complex built environment. So my thesis is that social order requires spatial order, and that architecture provides a long-term social memory as necessary substrate of the evolution. So my thesis is that if you look at the theory of evolution, there is a material substrate which has cross-generational permanence of reproduction for the evolutionary mechanism of mutation, selection, reproduction to work upon. That is the DNA, that material substrate is the DNA. And when we come into cultural evolution, meaning the becoming man, the evolving out of the animal kingdom into a cultural evolution, a progressive cultural evolution, requires a kind of material substrate upon which evolution can work, which is the built environment, which you can accrue piecemeal, unconsciously, and you can kind of select and then reproduce and accrue and build up that complexity, like the kind of complexity of the organism was built up. And without that, you will always ever have a small flock of apes. With each generation, that social memory not built up, starting from scratch. And here we have something, a chance to build up the complexity where each generation is building on the achievement of the prior generation. That's the function and power of the built environment. And we're building a complex social organism which moves from to ever larger groupings, ever larger integrated societal structures, and now to really mega cities and in fact a world community. So becoming man is intricately tied up with the evolution of a built environment where different social groups are distinguished and stabilized, different activities are ordered, sorted, and reproduced and evolving. And again, the design disciplines, where we also needed to make social distinctions more perceptually conspicuous, more precise, and systematic, beyond the variation of which is naturally given, the kind of distinctness of characters and social positions. And that was always the function of what now seems to be a kind of flippant fashion system. But the fashion system still delivers that. You can kind of look at a crowd and audience, you immediately kind of know their positionality, where they're coming from, their potential position in society, their profession, and then you navigate this world. And it's also a layer on the built environment. It's not just physical organization, it's also signification, ornamentation, distinction. This is what becoming human and the escape of the animal kingdom is built upon. And this kind of builds and builds, and it builds initially as kind of the laws of material optimization, why it's circular, because they're the most stable, the most easy to build. And it's kind of separating out and dividing and gathering and ordering, and then cumulatively accruing complexity and developing certain organs within that, like the kind of guild hall, the marketplace, the church. And these kind of organs of these communities, and they could keep growing, the first wall, the second wall, and that kind of, with these, and clinging to these kind of structures, the social organism and order elaborates itself, totally unconsciously. None of this is planned. It's perhaps imitated without understanding its rationality. It's kind of tradition-bound building, and it kind of crystallizes out of the agricultural landscape, these cities, like a bacteria colony crystallizes in a kind of nourishing substrate. It is a material process, a material evolutionary process. So in this sense. But then there is that moment, which I call the Big Bang of architecture, where we're no longer just subject to kind of repeating the same, like the father's generation. Everything keeps rolling the same tracks with minor, small improvements which might be kind of selected and continue. We're having a radical break, and architecture emerges for the first time out of tradition-bound building. When the architect separates, before there's a lot of self-build, then there's a kind of specialization of the crafts, and as the architect doesn't exist, he's just the kind of leader of the crafts group, and they just primarily just build. There's no drawing, or very little drawing. There's no anticipation or discourse. You just keep building what you've always been building. And then there's a moment where you pull away and you separate the architect. He is shifting from building into construction into the world of paper, and is drawing. He's only drawing. That's the moment of the Renaissance. The moment of Alberti, where he says architects don't build, they draw. And they speculate, invent the architecture, and then later on, somebody else executes. This is an enormous, and gives an enormous freedom and lightfootedness of creating various options, versions. And of course, the initial drawings are just redrawing and rationalizing what has evolved. But then, once that's started, you innovate, you invent. Immediately, you need to argue, because if you do something different, if you do what always has been done, you don't have to answer questions. If you do something different, and this is radically different from the Gothic and Romanesque, in its kind of order and its pristineness and its kind of inventiveness and its going back to ancient models, you need to argue, and theory comes to the fore. Immediately you have the architect. He is a kind of recognized author. He is innovating. He is drawing. And he is theorizing and publishing treatises on architecture, like Alberti, Servio, Palladio. And suddenly there's an enormous acceleration of progress and the discourse which projects back to the reality. But then, very quickly, in relatively historical terms, you're moving from the Renaissance, order of the city, projected into a kind of amorphous landscape, to Baroque, and suddenly that order of architecture, the invented order, projects out onto the horizon and wants to catch the totality of the territory. And you evolve a style from the Renaissance, which is an additive composition where each element is in itself complete and symmetrical, and you add these together, into a style which creates unities on a much larger scale. Now you're moving from the era of the city-state, the kind of early capital city-state like Florence, Venice, to the era of the absolutist nation-state, integrating a total economy, having administrative and having units of interaction which are much larger, and they need to be articulated, and to articulate them, that's the capacity of the Baroque language, with curvature which tying together larger arrays, convex, concave, with local asymmetries, drawing into more powerful global unifying symmetry. This could not have been designed in the style of the Renaissance. This requires the kind of plasticity of the Baroque, the deep relief, which is active for far away distant views, the kind of continuity of curvature, the ability to hold in tension and the unifying large units constructed and perceptually, palpably constructed, that would require the Baroque. And again, the kind of local asymmetry flips into a really powerful symmetry. Much more powerful if you put two circles next to each other. There is no power in the order, in the unity. The more amorphous and asymmetric you start with, and you flip that into the symmetry, the more powerful is the unifying effect. And we use that in some of our works, incidentally. And there's a lot of local asymmetry. You could actually then re-bring asymmetry into it and still create a powerful unity. Because there's a kind of broken symmetry. These are the kind of lessons we learned. But for me, the lesson here is more to say, try to understand that as styles move and progress, and this is not just change of fashion or an oscillation between the Apollonian and the Dionysian as has been described. This is real progress where each new style has particular superiority and congeniality with a new stage of development civilization. The Renaissance was not capable to deliver the Baroque city, which is a city of a unified nation state. And again, society moves on. There's industrial revolution. There's a kind of mass reproduction society based on assembly line and mass reproduction. Something totally different. And the kind of problematic and capacity of the Baroque has to be is a factor which has to be burst as well. And the new morphology is brought forward, and the new aesthetic and the new style has to be developed. In fact, the Baroque style is already kind of floundering in the era of first laissez-faire capitalist evolution, where you don't have the absolute mercantilist, centralized plans economy of kind of France of Louis XIV. You have a kind of more dynamic development in kind of North England. You have this kind of free agglomeration of city structures and factories in a kind of chaos, and that is the vital, that is what you need to start to love. And the kind of Baroque symmetry and order becomes a stifling force. And that brings forth an aesthetic revolution from the Baroque to the picturesque, the kind of celebration of chaos and uproar, tumult and kind of chaos. And then there's another stage when we're moving to the laissez-faire early capitalism, which has aesthetic of the picturesque, into the kind of 20th century consolidated monopoly capitalism, let's say, the capitalism of the great concerns, the big, integrated, bureaucratic corporations, which now set up mass production on a mass scale for everybody. The era of Fordism calls forth modernism in its endless repetition, using steel and concrete, throwing away symmetry, throwing away proportions, throwing away closure of composition, and having a kind of open-ended ramifying compositions, but always under the principles of separating out functions, specializing them, they could be all radically different, and then internally repeating. The same order we find in the bureaucratic corporation. Departments, specialized, separated out, specialized, and then internally repeated. Every single modernist project can be brought down to these principles. Look at them. Separating out, small, minimizing connections so you could really specialize and separate this out. They're radically different, each part. Open-ended in how many you put together. But each of them has the order of repetition within it. The Bauhaus is a canonical example of that. Again, the great advantages, rather than stuffing all these necessary components of an institution into one preconceived, symmetric, proportioned palace, you can optimize separately, pull out the apartment block and give it its own height, depth, floor to floor fenestration. And then you separate it out from the administrative track, the band windows, with its own kind of depth and height from the workshops. So that is the principles: separation, specialization, repetition, which is the key to modernism, and it could be expanded onto any scale. Again, separating out, specializing very different from here, internally repeated. The whole city was constructed along those logics. The Corbusier's city of 2 million inhabitants, the business district, radically different from the residential district, rather different from the production and the logistics district. So that feeling to be radically different in the different components. But only if you radically separate them and there's always a heaven, and then you repeat endlessly one time. The problem is supposed to be the house for minimum existence, the house of 20th century. And it's so correct. We have in this era what I call the universal consumption standard. And it is an immense leap forward for civilization. And you have in 1960 or 65, kind of 60 million German citizens all living on more or less the same standard of living, all of them superior to Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, of 300 years earlier, because they all had this kind of mass-produced house, electricity, flowing water, telephone, TV, of course only one or two channels, the same car, the Volkswagen in the garage, the kind of industrial food on the table, but the luxury of that, safe medical system looked after, good schooling, but all on that even mass repetitive scale which was delivered by the Fordist order and executed in terms of architecture by modernism. In retrospect, these are images of horror, but only because we moved on. The civilization desires and something else has the capacity to be something superior other. But these images were images of the glorious Brave New World, the slum clearings of the 60s, and delivering what I was telling you just now, kind of elegance of arriving in an apartment with flowing water, electricity. But they become the slums 25 years later, 30 years later, and they become the ironic dystopias of the 70s. And the 70s mark the crisis of modernism. This reproduction paradigm, which was delivering a huge leap, wasn't to be delivering the next leap. We kind of, on the basis of that material achievement, we were able to do more, we wanted more. Individuality, diversification of lifestyles. Each year something new, innovation, cycles of innovation, and that also meant production and communication need to be intensified. We have moved production capacities with the microeconomic revolution where we can kind of customize and mass customize and individualize product. That means we also need to think about design and redesign products and services, and it's not everybody the same holiday, but everybody an individualized holiday. And that society demands something else. It demands a continuous, innovative networking of everything with everything else. Before it was required to have one big plan, divide the labor, and separate out the different activities and let them beaver away for 10, 20 years, making mass reproduction. But the crisis of modernism meant that these images were no longer delivering, and the profession was left with the situation that their expertise, their intelligence, their principles were bankrupt, no longer wanted. Clients ran away from that. No one wanted to live there. So it was a real moment of crisis, and mavericks and radical brainstorming was required. That's why you have in the 70s these kind of, the AA, the kind of crazy fermentation of, where architecture seemed to become kind of art, sociology, philosophy, drawing philosophers. You don't know what to do. You brainstorm, you question everything. This could no longer go on. And that was allowed careers like this to proliferate. He didn't know what he was doing. He was just reacting. Maybe it was just a kind of intuitive attempt to translate into an architectural project the kind of fermentation of collaged new environments outside of architecture. It's part of a retrospective manifesto where you have the rehabilitation of historic centers, the kind of running away from architects into self-made environments. That was the 70s and 80s. And that is a kind of reflection of that, trying to catch up the profession and the discourse, trying to catch up with society which moved outside its scope. And we have, of course, where do you look? Anywhere you can, and that's mostly all the other sides of history. Anything except modernism was becoming inspiration to the next step. So postmodernism is an attempt to find something new And it wasn't about the old buildings, because they were delivering the kind of new sense of diversity, this new sense of differentiation in society. Could be mapped onto those, but quite quickly, for moving from postmodernism to deconstructivism, we were able to abstract what was interesting about this and leave the source materials behind as irrelevant. But there's clearly a progression from postmodernism into deconstructivism. And anything which was interesting and intelligent and forward-looking in postmodernism has been recuperated in deconstructivism. Differentiation, collage, the interpenetration of subsystems. And you can see the different spirit, the kind of, instead of separating out and repeating, it's kind of intensifying, bringing together, intersecting, interpenetrating, and differentiating and dynamizing. And again, abstract art, some of abstract art like style and serialism was brought forth modernism. Other things were left behind, so it's not the question of where the influences. The question is which fermentations persist and proliferate. And this was only able to persist and proliferate and make an impact in the 70s, inspiring this kind of work and this kind of work. And here you can see the difference between modernism, where it's neatly separated out. Here the kind of different, radically different layers interpenetrating and competing and intersecting in one territory. And you have multiple references to simultaneously structuring a space. That is the complexity of society you want to look at, and we looked at these, and for me this was one of the kind of shock of recognition when I was a young student in the early 80s when this came out, and I instantly, in all my peers, we were acquiring the capacity which was here for the first time post. Instead of drawing one pattern and moving on to the next place, to the next pattern, you kind of draw one pattern and you draw into the second and third pattern. We got that in a split second, and we've never looked back in those years, but the next step for us was, I was invited to teach at Columbia University in '93. We took up this idea of a complex layered matrix of spaces, but our systems were reacting to each other. They had gradient distributions. There was an attempt to have these layers inflect each other, resonate with each other, to build up more just a pure collage. That started in '93. It's still very chaotic. I'm not happy with the result, but you can see the desire, and that is now nearly 20 years ago, of a kind of parametric urbanism, if you like. And these were also the first time trying to use computer to generate some of these kind of tensions and force field and mutual inflections of subsystems. A discourse which continues today. And that's the kind of work of the 90s, which followed from that or continued and led to kind of projects like this, where we now winning competitions for large master plans, where we not show layer animation, where we have a kind of rich differentiation of subsystems of creation to context, but much more ordered and coherent, and where you can read off the kind of the skyline becomes a kind of information about the plan, etc. Or we looked at corporate organization instead of these kind of separate out bureaucracies, these kind of dense, three-dimensional field structures, these three-dimensional bureau landschafts where everything communicates with everything else, but is also differentiated and placed in a kind of order of differentiation. And we, in fact, took these kind of principles to deliver back already a kind of mature high-performance space for high-performance social institution. This is the central administration and engineering and auditing building for a new BMW plant in Leipzig, a highly sophisticated robotic plant with a lot of administration, engineering, and we created, instead of modernist-wise, create the administration buildings as a separate unit away. We launched it right into the center. We let every production flow move right through. We try to connect and communicate and intensify communication throughout the building. It's become kind of a nervous network, a kind of nervous center of the whole factory. you lead us in, you kind of make transparent, you open to view, you allow, make navigable a complex kind of flow diagram. And what is also important here is that you make that an aesthetic project, because not only just to organize these flows that objectively can happen, but that you are able to follow them, that they're perceptually palpable, that you can be drawn through the space, and you find the different layers of communication. And that means all the pragmatic elements you have, the lighting tracks, the structure, the handrails, everything is brought under a kind of powerful formalism. So there's a strong formalist project here, which creates a kind of, which takes all these complex requirements and forces them into an articulatory, communicating, navigating project. And this kind of attempt to take the aspects, the pragmatic aspects which is thrown at you by engineers as requirements and constraints, and heighten them into an aesthetic, inverted commas, artistic project of articulation. That's the core competency of architects, which should hierarchize the space, which kind of draws you through circulatory channels, and at the same time differentiating structures, places and spaces, but are all visually connected with the deep penetration of space, where at each point you can see multiple things going on which might be relevant in an organization where everything needs to continuously networked and checked and coordinated with everything else, rather than disappearing in a little cell, beavering away on something separate. So these kind of spaces of simultaneity, where you, in a glance, you can strategize your next move. You unfold in front of you 50 or more different opportunities of communication, of activity, unfolded and ordered and ready to make your next move. This is the kind of space we're constructing. This is the kind of challenge which only parametricism can answer. These very complex, intensified communication scenarios, these complex scenes made legible, navigable, and elegantly, everything finds itself elegantly and communicates efficiently for a few minutes and moves on to the next interaction. So this is again just a history in a kind of nutshell, from the medieval tradition on building to the Renaissance, the Baroque, modernism, postmodernism, and deconstructivism as transitional, searching periods, taken over and cleared out, and everything innovative in postmodernism and deconstructivism and more innovation is subsumed in parametricism, and only parametricism, I would argue, not postmodernism, that would be an absurd assumption, could deliver a global new paradigm for finally making, after 30 years of search, a real impact in changing the built environment. So this is the kind of way I want to align the great styles with the stages of world civilization. And styles are these cycles of innovation, ultimately, the epochal styles. And you progress in two ways. Radically and obviously, revolutionary progress, development, and establishment of a new style. Parametricism taking over. But then you have cumulative progress as well. You can't just do every 3 years a new style. You need to develop and mature a style, of course. Look at the modernism. Earlier was this fabulous complex by Wallace Harrison in Albany. That couldn't have been produced in 1925. So it needs a few decades of maturation, of building up a kind of expertise and repertoire and technology and confidence to deliver. And that's what we're trying to build. So I invite you to kind of to participate in collective projects. And only then can we kind of, with cumulative progress, and cumulative progress in the avant-garde with respect to parametricism is already happening for 15 years at least. And 10 years accelerated through the new computational techniques and technologies, where we're saying now scripting instead of modeling, for instance. It's even more profound than the move from the hand drawing to the digital model, is moving from the hand model to the kind of scripted system, where everything is rule-based. So I'm I'm distinguishing these great epochal styles, and then we have transitional styles, but we're also having subsidiary styles, like within modernism you had the white modernism evolving to the brutalism, into metabolism, into the high tech, but all of them is modernism, all of them is separation, specialization, repetition. And I believe that in parametricism it's an very open-ended field of exploration. There will be many subsidiary styles, so those of you who are very keen on leaving a mark and wanting to be super original, you can still tie yourself to the project of parametricism. You just develop a subsidiary style within it. If you step outside, I predict that it will be marginalized. You will be like kind of Kletschnik, disappearing in some kind of forgotten, marginalized condition. I don't want to go too much in detail on this, but there is also a distinction between a passive style, which is only kind of retrospectively described, an active style, which evolves a confidence of innovation, like the Renaissance and the Baroque, but doesn't yet reflect and doesn't have yet the category of style as a self-reflective, self-descriptive category with forward drive. But the category of style was brought into the discourse in the 19th century and became a kind of, I would say, attractor which pulled in the end architecture and allowed modernism to happen, because there was a 50-year quest of what is the modern style? That question was posed in the middle of the 19th century by Semper and others. The category of style posed that question, and the answer was finally convincing everybody in the early 20s. And parametricism, I think, is the epochal style after modernism. And it is my task, as far as I'm concerned, to push that from the avant-garde to the mainstream. And it's not my style, it's Evan's style, it's Chris's style, it's everybody, it's a whole generation of architects globally, theorists, writers, experimenters, whether they know it or not, accept it or not. In my description, they're all contributing to that great collective project, and they are the formalists as well as kind of those who reflect on the new programmatics. They all feed into a global new trajectory, and this is kind of organs, theoretical organs, where experimental work is published and discussed, are extremely important. And I've tried to contribute to that, for instance, in a number of issues, and trying to write and argue and inspire. Okay, so what is parametricism? I'm giving a conceptual definition simply that all elements of architecture become parametrically malleable. And that's something quite radical. And you could call it an ontological shift, a shift in the most fundamental, basic primitives and building stones of all architectural work and composition. So for 5,000 years, including modernism, it was just these Platonic, rigid, hermetic primitives, and they're kind of a handful of those composed, meaning placed next to each other. That was what it was always only about, all the way to modernism. Deconstruction started to kind of jam these into each other, but now we have something totally different. We have new primitives, a new ontology, splines, blobs, slurs, particles, and scripts. A totally different world in which we can generate spatialities and spatial organizations and create a totally new physiognomy for the 21st century. So instead of drawing inert straight lines with a ruler or circular kind of on piece of paper and kind of stare at it and then draw a second or third line, a few minutes later we have now setting up these kind of dynamical systems. The line is a kind of arrays and networks of lines which are kind of configuring and reconfiguring under different force fields and parametric sensitivities which are given as a kind of collective formation process. And it's a kind of different way, a different medium of design, a different universe of possibility, and a different speed of searching orders and a new level of complexity and intricacy of achieving orders. So that happened. But similarly, the surface has been kind of activated, no longer just a kind of simple flat sheet or plate, insensitive, but something which is pliable, malleable, which can register occupational patterns in the ceiling or floor. It could kind of resonate with influences and affiliations. It could be kind of sensitive and communicate, if you like. And of course, the same with the volumes, the kind of famous blocks. And this is the capacity of this kind of way of working. It is still a system, it's an order of iteration, but it's capable of radical differentiation. It sets up identities and spaces, and yet it is able to affiliate and integrate with context. And the modernists would have had just a third term, a series of kind of uninflected, insensitive blocks to offer. So there's an enormous superiority in this way of working, and that shows because we convince clients about the rationality and advantages of this way of working. Instead of giving 100 blocks of the same, you can give a differentiated product, a whole array of types of blocks, for types of clients, for types of spaces. You can give an order so that these differences are not just becoming a kind of visual chaos, that you can find your way and you can find the larger ones, the smaller ones, and you can integrate existing architecture. So a series of advantages become compelling and allow us to win most master plans we enter. Operationally, so this is kind of the essential conceptual definition, everything parametric and malleable, which allows for the intensification of relations within the building and its parts and spaces and between it and its context. But I can also bring that more to the point in terms of operational definition, meaning a heuristic, meaning some kind of rules of sums and principles by which you can kind of work through your project and improve your project both on the functional side and on the formal side. So formally, principally, we're saying also negatively, it's important that you stop falling back on old ways of working, that you rigorously and persistently test out the opportunities of the new principles and ways of working. Otherwise, it's not a real test. If the first difficulty fall back on old ways of thinking and working, that's not the way. So we need to be quite clear that there's a negative for heuristics, that we are no longer using these kind of figures. And in fact, for most of our students and our staff and my friends and colleagues I know, which is a huge kind of group, they simply for over 10 years have never used any of these forms anyway. So in a sense, the principles are formulating a more kind of retrospective acknowledgement that this is taboo and that students simply refuse to do these forms. And they're right. There's lack of availability and they need to be rejected. So, and this one, which has been going on not only in classicism, there was always a repetition, but in modernism, of course, Rousseau is no longer what represents society. It's also kind of damn easy, and this lack of variety is also excluded. And we don't just compose by repeating. So, and the last negative is also quite important, because this negative is, I'm rejecting also, and all my students and colleagues reject, this kind of collage, this pure agglomeration of difference, which in fact happened after the crisis of modernism. That's what actually happened all over the world. You take away the ordering structures of modernism, of separation, specialization, repetition, and then you, because they are dysfunctional, you rather let the kind of free-for-all happening. That is more vital, but it is generating a kind of visual chaos quite quickly. I call that the kind of garbage spill model of development. That is what the reality which takes place since the crisis of modernism, since the end of modernist town planning and urbanism. The world over, we have nothing but this garbage spill model of development. And that creates sameness, no matter how much difference is in the garbage can. And each garbage can is different. They all look the same, because it becomes a kind of white noise. And this lack of order needs to be rejected, and we need to move on. So where are we going? We've rejected the principles of modernism, we've rejected all that has taken place in reality since then, and also, by the way, postmodernism, deconstructionism is kind of a celebration of that kind of collage approach. We reject all that, and where we're going is, in fact, we're going here. We're using other inspirational sources. You need always a kind of source, kind of clue, a hint, something to work upon and work away from and with. And that is the kind of models. Kind of natural systems are integrally differentiated. There's a lot of difference and nuance and variation, but they're kind of ordered and lawfully structured. So that you can kind of find yourself. There's an order of transformation. And this kind of complex, varied order is what we're looking for. And there is an example, somebody in architecture, actually I was a student at Stuttgart, Frei Otto, who has done that. But it was initially not noticed much. He was a kind of sole pioneer. But now he's become, in retrospect, a great hero and only precedent and precursor of parametricism, with this idea of using natural systems as lawful, self-organizing, material computation systems which generate form in a force field in relation to performative criteria. But now we take these kind of, we're no longer constrained to using these kind of physical models. We now can have these kind of simulation and animation processes, which in fact is bringing the kind of laws and logic of nature into the domain of architecture through animation media and science simulation media, which we appropriate. We bring that order into the computer, and now we can set it free and push the parameters out of natural ranges. We can in fact also script willfully and new laws of association in nature, new correlations, no longer constrained to the ones we find in nature. We're creating a whole new, rich and intricate second nature where we can integrate real performative constraints, but also we can invent new constraints just to create a visual order. And that delivers this kind of work in Zari Architects, at the AADRL, at the Vienna University of Applied Arts, at Innsbruck University Department of Experimental Architecture, I'm teaching. And this is just the way at the AA, in fact, we're working with these kind of, a lot of these physical models and physical form finding and material computation system as the first stage to tease out logics and formation logics. And we do that also as architects, going at nature and translating, and then bring into the digital, bring into the repertoire as a kind of big, you need to develop a kind of resource, a kind of repertoire out of which to select, investigate. You know, always something to work with. You cannot work off staring at a blank screen. These are some of the projects we've been doing recently. And instead of this endless repetition of the same, you have differentiating the field and differentiating up the axis, for instance, of something like the tower. So this was what it looks like, and now the formal principles positively. I gave you the negative principles, the taboos, and now I give you the kind of positive principles, which in a sense have become a kind of productive dogma, if you like. So all forms are malleable, variable, inherently. Anything, any of the privileges you touch is inherently degrees of freedom, and you can always think of more degrees of freedom, more ways of manipulating. So that generates kind of, everything we do is generated out of that. And therefore you select a whole array and field of potential. And the same torus could be turned into this building, perhaps, other buildings. And there's asymmetrized, adapted, differentiated. But of course, these malleable forms could also have an inbuilt constraining intelligence, or constrained, for instance, structural logics, the catenary domes. We've been recently using a lot of these kind of shell structures. But the interesting thing is when they become kind of not the symmetrical shell, but a kind of asymmetric, more with more degrees of freedom shell, the clusters of shell, and again, you can kind of build in these constraints and develop intelligent malleable forms. And the next principle is, instead of repetition, we differentiate. We not just repeat, but we also not just, we develop these kind of genotypes which proliferate, but as they proliferate, they differentiate. And they also differentiate perhaps intelligently for a reason, for certain performative adaptation. But also, a differentiated field is so much more easy to navigate. You can follow vectors of transformations. You can be drawn along a gradient, like bacteria allows itself to be drawn along a kind of nutritional gradient. And therefore, these things are deployed relative to sun exposure maps, for instance, like we're doing in here, and you really can incorporate engineering intelligence as an opportunity for articulation and for energetic performance. But our task is not these calculations, but utilizing these calculations for a kind of sophisticated translation, articulation project, where the sun exposure map is translated into kind of differentiation of the Brise-Soleil, for instance, and therefore optimized but also differentiating and articulating. A volume, and then you move such a city, you have sense of orientation even on an overcast day. And you can use this kind of proliferation of meaningful typologies also with respect to kind of the urban field. And this might then adapt to kind of underlying stratum of a topography or kind of network of traffic, etc. And the final most important principle, instead of that kind of agglomeration of pure difference, you set up correlations, affiliations, associations, and you have these differentiated systems, and they could be radically different to each other, and you start associating logics you develop. You're creative in developing and scripting correlations, like, for instance, the field and swarm of lights is one subsystem, the kind of pleating and folding and rippling of the surface is another one, each with their own performative logic, each with their own form logic, but then there's a kind of script which ties one to the other, and you get a kind of lawful correlation. Or every action is a reaction. Instead of putting the tower onto the ground without resonating, it starts to make a kind of resonating impact, which is then to be interpreted functionally, and of course there could be many different ways. So your creativity is called upon to how you differentiate, and how, in what way you correlate, and there's an infinite project of always differentiating more, correlating more, and giving more degrees of freedom and more order. So here we have the kind of tower which differentiates from a square to a T cross-planar section to an H section, and correlated with that is the transformation of, and that is the program from retail to office to residential, and that is correlated with the facade from closed to curtain wall to kind of balcony out of this. And the system has the capacity to do that. This is the kind of correlation of subsystems. So here the tower, the skeleton is one subsystem. Again, you use a finite element analysis to script the network, which kind of traces and has intelligent differentiation, but it's also characterizing the tower. It makes a visual difference between the bottom, middle, and top of the tower. It recognizes, it accentuates other distortion in the tower. It traces and accentuates in terms of structure network. Then you can kind of trace that and in terms of opening and closed, in terms of the disposition of floors and voiding out of floors. Then you kind of integrate a structure which again has a certain law, an equidistant project from the outset, project back to the core, creates a kind of differentiated tightness or openness at the core, and then you can make inferences from the tightness of the rib to the distance of the depth of the space. So these inferences are very important. They make it measurable. If you have laws of association, you can also later on read backwards and make inferences, because each of the subsystems is a representation of other subsystems, and therefore becomes kind of indicating a subsystem. So you can navigate the space. You can use one system as a sign system of the other systems. And of course there's an enormous elegance and beauty and awesome sense of organic intricacy in such build-up composition where you really have to, it becomes sensitive to disturbance. That means it has very intricate order. And as you build up these compositions, and you can always expand their density of connections, but with each new element it becomes more difficult. You cannot just throw something at it, like with the deconstructivist composition, you just throw another volume at it. It never is difficult, it's always easy, you just pile it in. Here you need to kind of work at it. You need to kind of bring it into a system of cross connections. You need to kind of intelligently stitch it in and correlate it and cross correlate it. Therefore it becomes much more, you really progress the project. After you work it through, it becomes a much more evolved entity. So in a nutshell, you could really boil it down to these taboos and dogmas, and yet on that abstract level that they are formulated, they're very liberating. I mean, it's an invitation to give more degrees of freedom to your primitives, to differentiate in more unexpected ways, and then to correlate with further systems in new and unexpected ways. And you can always increase the power of your project. You can always differentiate further. You can always allow the systems to be responsive to yet another element. Maybe a distant element in the environment is now radiating through, and the project develops sensitivity to that object, because everything suddenly now folds and bends towards it, while everything else which is happening already continues to happen. So you can really, it's an infinite project of elaborating this complex variegated order. But what is important to remember is that style is not only a formal system and method of advancing the project formally, spatially. It's also encompasses a new attitude towards function and program, the life process, the functional side. The lead distinction is form versus function. So on the functional side, we're saying, again, negatively, no fixed stereotypes. No social homogenization like the modernists. And no segregated zoning. We don't do that anymore. Because that's dysfunctional ultimately. So we have a new sense of what's socially functional. Positively, we're now saying instead, all functions are parametric. They're variable event scenarios. We don't just say the auditorium. What auditorium, what configuration, for how many people, with what kind of connections, and what kind of dynamic event scenarios, and so on. All program domains are differentiated. It's not the endless repetition of one kind of program domain. And everything communicates with everything else, instead of remaining separate and isolated. So these are the functional heuristics. And these are just heuristics. How you differentiate the program. That depends on the social institution you interact and you're offering with. And but things are brought into proximity. These are, again, the heuristic principles which assure that you will develop a project which is state-of-the-art, which doesn't fall back to fallacious old ways of thinking. And that's why I can say with confidence that Parametricism is a new epochal style after modernism. And I'm also demonstrating now that Parametricism is real. And I'm showing you, I'm just making a thumb cinema. It works on all scales, on all program domains, and all territories of the world, as far as we're concerned, with respect to the kind of projects and products and interiors and installations and objects we've been creating. And this little flick through increases in scale. And so we're moving from these products, installations, to interiors, to exhibition designs, to smaller buildings and interiors. And all of this here is real and executed and existing in the world, and sometimes as manifestos, sometimes already in real, active, effective, high performance. And maybe I'll stop here for instance, just an example. This is the most mundane kind of park and ride scheme in the suburbs of Strasbourg. So imagine a kind of suburban condition with a parking lot, a train station, a bus station. What could be kind of less inspiring and more prone to kind of continuing the disfigurement of a kind of suburban non-place? And here we're trying to do, if you bring these aspects into close proximity, into intercorrelation, and you impose, which is very important, a ruthless formalism, then you're able to tie something together to create an identity. So here the car park is in effect, instead of having, they were asking for 2 car parks on each side of the road, we just said no, it's a one thrust. So we changed this material thrusting through the road and pulling in, connecting with the roof, which is allowing the train in and allowing the bus in as the interchange with the car park. Then we create the formalism of that curve. The curve ties together. The banalities of street demarcations, of lampposts are turned into kind of radical formalist medium of spatial articulation and organization. So these become kind of ruthlessly brought under this formalism, directed swarm of lines. So the parking partition is affiliated to the lamppost, to the light, that migrates into the columns as arrays of columns and into the slots and cuts into the roof. So we get these kind of formalism thrusting through, like a BMW. Everything was brought under the most ruthless of formalisms. And through that, it becomes instrumental and functional. Because the world, architecture is functioned through navigation, legibility, social gathering, appeal, and not like machines and pipes and systems under the hood and below the ground. And that's why you cannot make that kind of dichotomy between kind of an aesthetic, articulated project, and a kind of pragmatic, functional project, because the functionality is only through appearance, ultimately. And those functionalities which are through physical force are the primitive, the unsophisticated, the trivial functionalities. What we need to engage in is the sophisticated, high-density, high-communicated functionalities which require ultimately the kind of formal and aesthetic and articulatory and semiotic project. So I'm just going through more stuff as it's increasing in scale, and programs, schools, exhibition spaces, museums, offices, residential spaces. It's the whole ambit. Sport venues. Administration building. And again, it's a kind of complexity of different departments and their confluence and intersection, and communication spaces, museums. And again, perhaps a moment of pause. The capacity of the style to integrate a radically new entity with its own identity and coherence into an existing texture by having a kind of sense of embedding, of affiliation to kind of textual striation, embedding and integrating with existing structures, affiliating with different urban directionalities, creating unity across the corner and tying together, creating unity between exterior and interior, and continuing a space which continuously evolves and draws you through. It's a kind of ever evolving and migrating and changing space. There's snapping from room A to room B to room C. It's continuously drawn. Sometimes very quiet and contemplative, sometimes where things start to intersect. There's more directions coming together. That's where we introduce the vertical connections. And the street is cutting right through into the main internal corridor. These affiliations are important. There's a kind of closed phase and there's the open phase. There's the moment of deep visual penetration of the. I'm still outside, but I'm already inside the domain of the space. I'm getting glimpses of various levels. And again, I'm outside, I'm participating already within the life of the museum. Then I step in and there's a kind of multiple choice of trajectories. The architecture unfolds below, above, all around, and in deep layers. With kind of deep vistas in all directions. This full three-dimensionality of simultaneity of connections and continuities, and then the kind of quieting down and opening up again the second time. And again kind of ruthless forms of affiliation to order the overall space. If all these different parts were left with their own random morphology, would just create a kind of disarticulated visual chaos. So the kind of formalization is important, but without the slightest degree of even compromising the pragmatics of functioning, because the pragmatics of functioning will always leave degrees of freedom. There's always functional equivalent solutions, and you select now on the basis of articulation the final morphologies. And it kind of keeps drawing, keeps moving, keeps pulling. And with every step, something new pulls into view, something comes out of you. And again, these moments of connection back to the exterior environment, and this kind of idea of being inside, looking out, looking through the outside back to the inside. This kind of sense of suspension, complex matrix and network of spaces, everything communicates with everything else. Similar effects in the Guangzhou dramas, this kind of moment of unfolding space below, above, and deep kind of vistas from inside to outside as well. And then different world, which is own kind of coherency on the inside. And again, it moves on to infrastructure projects, to large urban projects. And the kind of final project I want to show, which will open in May, a big kind of cultural center in Azerbaijan, which comprises a museum, a conferencing center, a library. The conferencing spills out into this plaza, so the continuity is also of ground surface, there's roof surface, relations between inside and outside, relations between kind of landscape condition, continuing into interior landscape, etc. And again, the building looks different from each site, has different spaces, different offerings, but also it is recognizable and re-recognizable as the same in all its different manifestations. So it's quite different from here, but you know it has different exterior spaces, different vistas, and it's a kind of chameleon, but always recognizable. And it has this kind of logic to follow. And I think it will be an effortless, elegant space of multiple communications congregating and enjoying an elegant, informative kind of evening and day out. And I leave you with that. I'm sorry it took a few minutes longer than anticipated, but I would like to invite questions or contributions, criticisms. Yep.
I guess, thanks for the lecture, first off. But my biggest question about parametricism in general is sort of the difference between style and maybe methodology. And it seems to me like parametrics is maybe the wrong word to use for the style, because it's also the word for a tool, right? And if you confuse the two, it sort of reduces the potentials of the tool, I think. And it seems like...
And it reduces the style as well, by the way.
Yeah. Right. So I think Right, to be reduced to just one set of operations, whether they're performative or aesthetic or whatever, and just responding to one cross-section of data, it seems to, and that would assure a project's being relevant, seems like a mistake. I've just seen a lot of people sort of point to anything that comes out of the computer as being parametric, even when a parametric software wasn't involved, at all, right? And it seems like defining a style based on NURBS or splines or whatever would be just the same as defining a style based on like the pencil or something like that, right? Like it's a total confusion in that you need some sort of authorship either way, and to call the style just parametric confuses what's the program and what's sort of the social ambitions. And what seems strange to me is that Zaha, as the office, is one of the best examples of a firm that's used a whole bunch of mediums, from painting to the computer, so from really primitive to really high tech, to organize spaces, and yet the style is being defined as parametric, and I don't think it's a good idea.
It's not defined. I mean, I think when we come in, first of all, don't get fixated on a name, right? A name needs to be proposed and offered, and you can propose another name. I mean, modernism. You can kind of stare at the phrase and kind of think that that the criticism could be based on pulling out the association of it. That's just a question of semantics. I mean, I'm happy to put this to this position, and I might call it something else, so that's not the issue. So you need to engage with two things. On the one hand, you need to distinguish what I'm talking about, but you should really then go to the writings, to the article, and look at the layered definition I'm offering in terms of the form and the functional heuristics, in terms of the claim that a style is a cycle of innovation that has a kind of certain functional thrust in terms of how we handle and understand and translate function, as well as in terms of unfolding the formal repertoire. Don't get hooked up on a name. Distinguish what I'm proposing and how I define it, and compare that to what is happening out there in the world we observe. What is happening in the offices, what is happening in the universities. That's what I try to summarize and try to describe, try to rationalize, explicate, and guide forward to the next step. So the confusion is yours, in fact. I'm not confused about these things, and the world is happening, and I think there is some confusion in that whole panoply of ongoing research and experiments, and that's what I'm trying to clarify. Now you can come in and help clarifying that and give me another kind of description, but if you kind of ponder and try to kind of stare at that name, and I think this is not an engagement with my approach, with my theory, not even with my lecture.
I think that as a theorist, you have to take responsibility for the names that you're giving.
Yeah, but it's such a trivial and trite point. I mean, I've given that point already. Give me a different name. I'm not insisting on it. It's such a superficial point.
Right. I just think this is my last thing. But it just because it seems like you're getting a lot of traction out of having that name, basically. I'm like, even though I'd like to see parametricism as a term and as a manifesto as just a way of like being specific about what the discourse and what the goals of architecture are today and techniques and whatnot, it seems more like a sort of power grab in the same way as the international style, as just sort of labeling post facto all these different design intentions and movements that may be using the same techniques, and then using that to sort of, I don't know, basically skyrocket your own position in the discourse. And I think the name
can I
is a
come in? First of all,
to that, in a way.
the first first thing I wanted to make sure, and since I'm only illustrating, I have enough illustrations out of their own kind of ambit, but I could also fill a lecture with the work of many, many others, and in fact I'm working on a big exhibition under the label of Parametric, which is going to be much bigger than, for instance, something like the Decon show, which has 7 people. It's going to have kind of 50 to 100 people in it, and it's really a collective movement. So if I'm showing my work, it's the work I have, and I have enough to show, and I can explain and take responsibility for. But in terms of the theoretical discourse, it encompasses much, much more what's going on. And I think, again, to come back to an earlier point, that the parametric tools, and I mean the tools are important. You need to recognize that nearly each style had kind of evolved the medium to some extent. Renaissance with perspective, Baroque with projective geometry, modernism with the axionometric. But I mean, this is of course much grander, much more radical and transformative. And I'm just saying, mentioning some of these examples, lines, rods. Ultimately, for me, it's scripting and setting up rules and logics which radiate through. And if I apply color to a geometry, I will use a script to do so. And that continues. So the medium is not fixed. Now we're talking about agent-based modeling and swarms of agents and so on. And that's within a paradigm. I use that because it is momentous and critical and important, but it's not. It cannot be reduced to it. And you're quite right. I think you can make parametricist architecture without these tools to a certain extent, because it's more about this sense of giving variable forms, differentiation of systems, affiliations. I'm criticizing a lot of the work as being kind of single systems too much. I want to move from single system differentiation to multiple systems and increase complexity. And of course, the desires and early anticipations and premonitions of this kind of work was produced in advance of the arrival of these new media. This is not only the case with Italian architects, where we use ship curves, endless arrays of ship curves and feather curves, and Xerox distortions, and all sorts of ways, and using perspective projection as a tool of distorting an array of fragments. So that was prior to the computational revolution. And Greg Lynn just gave a lecture at Yale, where he also stressed the fact that he designed in and also the Eisenman folding was kind of pre-digital, and that is what leads to parametricism. So you can't reduce it to it, but you also have to recognize the enormous momentousness and power. And if I use parametricism, it's not only that we're using parametric tools, but it's that the design itself, whether it's executed by computer or computer without computer, is inherently talking about multiple parameters, variables on the level of function as well as of form. That's what it motivates. So I will invite you to kind of see where I'm coming from, the motivation. The category of style I want to reinvigorate, because I think it's important. You mentioned international style was a great moment, I think. Also a retrospective moment. Retrospective intelligence is always a bit more mature and serious intelligence than a kind of prospective one, perhaps. Anyway, the owl of Minerva is flying at night, as Hegel said. So I do like that comparison, and I would want to live up to that comparison. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Sorry to interject. As a student that's obviously contemporarily just been exposed to these types of procedures and types of tactics that are associated with parametricism, I guess not essentially a flaw, but an underproduced or something that holds great potential in this possible realm is the use of the parameters. But what I've seen has been explicitly formal explorations, and that's totally fine. That's totally interesting and great. But if you spoke about an ontological response and an ontological issue, and if that ontological issue is in a sense addressing the human body, or the being as a human body and one as sentience, isn't it kind of critical to address the importance that sentient beings are formulated by cultural and social implications?
Exactly.
And so through the social and cultural implications, what are the explicit parameters that you could apply that are not necessarily separate from the formal realm, but intertwined. Because if you look at the work like someone as Toyo Ito, I guess his work isn't explicitly parametric or parameter-based, but it's very, very similar in a sense. And I guess the successfulness of that work depends on the cultural and socioeconomic evidences, which his work is still limited to Asia, specifically Japan, and he has a couple projects in Europe, I think. But I guess my question is twofold. If you're speaking about phenomena, is the phenomena you're addressing the work that is creating those phenomena, or the work that exists due to those phenomena? Because I think there's a higher sociology that exists than what was addressed. And then the second question was, what kinds of examples of specific social interactive parameters I guess could be used to further advance this technique?
Okay, let me start with the last question. What are the kind of social domains where architecture is challenged because the particular certain social domains are more demanding because they're more complex, there's more different players, more patterns of interaction, more density of communication. And one of the domains which we've looked at very systematically, and for instance at the AADRL for 3 years, was the realm of corporate organization. So you have large corporate organization, which is no longer the kind of bureaucracy which kind of separates out different departments in isolation, but these are kind of now high density network organizations with a lot of outside collaborators and companies coming in and out, with a lot of continuous reconfiguration of teams and sub-teams and matrix organizations where you have a double affiliation between the departmental affiliation and the project affiliation. So it becomes quite rich and complex and dynamic, with a lot of, kind of informal and self-organizing happenings. So that was for me the domain where you said, wow, this is really rich, complex, how can you kind of structure such an environment? You have the flexibility requirement, you also cannot just give them an empty, unstructured box. They want to be kind of, differentiate themselves out into kind of richly articulated bureau landscape where they find different niches. So you nearly kind of pre-differentiate the domain and then allow, and you give a rich variety, even unspecific to a certain extent, and then you allow the kind of organization to kind of settle in and differentiate out, but these things remain connected, they remain continuous. These are this kind of continuous swarm-like gradient, sponge-like deep three-dimensional bureau landschafts. Great. And then we're taking the furniture and the swarm of tables and lights and creating territories for densification of these elements. And so that was one domain, I think, and there you rely on not on cutting it into boxes and walls. You need to kind of territorialize with nuanced, nearly semiotics, to set thresholds to kind of order but they always can be crossed if they have to be. And it's the way that the space is highly latent with multiple readings. So they kind of it can be reread and the scene can be recomposed and decomposed through kind of the ephemeral layers, tying in and reconfiguring new ways with the existing. So that was one domain where I think the superiority of parametricism is clear. You come in with a minimalism, you just spoil complexity, you separate, you just bleach out kind of nuance. And also if you use the deconstructivist way, you just kind of create that garbage spill which nobody knows what is where anymore. So here we have the kind of example. Now when you mention the kind of cultural specificity, I mean, one thing is sure that instead of, unlike modernism, parametricism has an inbuilt adaptiveness. So it was when we colonize the world, which we hopefully will, it will be with more kind of sensitivity to regional climatic conditions. Modernism just had armed with the air conditioning under the hood, could stamp out the same glass box the world over. And we don't have to do that. We can be much more versatile and nuanced and varied. We can recuperate the kind of intelligence of the vernaculars of this world, which was pre-air conditioning, the kind of adaptation to the conditions of rain and wind and water and sunlight, and that would articulate and identify and differentiate these environments and make them more productive, also in terms of an articulating project. So that's and cultural nuances for me are not the cliches of making something recognizable as kind of typical X, Y, Z. I think that's really not what's the case, but you do still have certain regional cultures which are in the world division of labor. There's certain, there's the kind of Silicon Valley innovative software engineering versus the kind of financial center in Wall Street. There's a different mode of communication, different responsibilities, and then you have a kind of North Italian design clusters. These are the cultures. It's not whether it's Italian or in America, anyway, you have all these different ethnic groups. It's irrelevant. I don't think that Ito is relevant only for Japan. If you would have never heard of him, because architecture is world architecture. It's a global discourse, and Ito and anybody else, wherever you go, in whatever territory you go, I think you will be working with these principles, which I believe are global best practice. And they apply as much to India as well as to China, to Africa, to wherever you go. In all these places you find people eager and wanting to participate in world culture and want to integrate themselves in the world economic division of labor and find innovative ways of working, and they face similar challenges. They're also all on the net. They're also all kind of geared up with all the other best practices which are given through the mass media and the internet. Why should they be excluded from the global best practice of architecture and urbanism? So this is global, but it's at the same time it's highly differentiated and nuanced. But it's not the kind of old traditional cliches of culture which we need to worry about. Not at all. Anybody else?
Over there.
Yeah.
I hope this is a quick question, but what do you think, if anything, stands in the way of parametricism from being the same sort of real-world on-the-ground method of modeling as has?
Real world, underground. On the ground. Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, what stands in the way is, in a sense, a culture of the discipline, first of all, which there's a kind of culture of discourse and a certain cast of character which has evolved because there was the crisis of modernism, which had to bring forth the kind of freewheeling, free brainstorming, idiosyncratic, individualistic character of trying to find something new, which generated kind of its own inertia of ideology, the kind of Peter Cooks, and I mean, they made contributions, clearly, and the Wolf Briggses, and I don't know who else to mention, the Bartlett as a kind of institution and way of working of this world. There are of an era, but they prevent, in a sense, because they have a gut reaction against the attempt to systematize, they have a gut reaction against a kind of larger project. They think it's only about kind of always remaining different and other and proliferating and inventing something new every Monday morning. If you do that, you'll never impact. So there needs to be a kind of change in the cast of character, change in the kind of ambitions we formulate collectively. And I think there's, first of all, for me, that's why these kind of, I get a lot of these often quite kind of negative and hostile responses, the kind of resistance to being kind of consumed into something larger, wanting to keep options open. That's one aspect. The other aspect, I think, is, of course, but that's what we're working with. Investing in new technology, production, fabrication technology, which brings down the cost of these kind of complexities. And that is happening very, very fast. And the economic crisis seems to have put a kind of hold a little bit on that. A lot of people actually in the kind of discourse lost nerve and thought this was kind of parametricism on some of these experiments were kind of part of a kind of pre-2008 aberration of history. I don't believe that. I mean, of course we had excesses and I think that, but it's also a maturing process. So I believe that investment in these kind of production technologies kind of carry a different spirit of discourse within the discipline, and the recognition outside of the discipline that there is a new paradigm and style in the offering is very important, because that's why I think the category style is important. It's the only category which means anything outside of the discipline. that would be the only news, worse the headlines, when it would become transparent and clear that there's a new kind of style, a new paradigm, a new way of working, which a new kind of physiognomy for the built environment, which mayors and corporations and clients should look out for to understand and participate to upgrade their own institutions. That's, I think, what is lacking. And I have no doubt that this will push through, because it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's compelling in its capacities, its repertoires and intelligence. It's the only game in town, also the only original new agenda and project and style. What is minimalism? What's new about that? What do you expect? What kind of transformation or advances do you expect from buying into minimalism? It's nothing but a kind of retro modernism. What would you expect from kind of postmodernism, kind of new vernacular kind of approach? I mean, what is there? Where are we going? And I'm saying, and I'm geared at the same time. I realize that what I'm calling Parametric as a collective project has a lot of, it's in its infancy intellectually levels. A lot of the practitioners have not grasped the capacity to be taken seriously. And there are, of course, in the division of labor in the discipline, you have those formalists who still reject being instrumentalized. But as we discussed earlier, there's these kind of formalists, they have also, there's a kind of necessary false consciousness, because if you think it's only about form, you can proliferate and elaborate formal repertoires more rapidly, more proliferously and productively. But that can be the stance of the profession, and that also once you proliferate repertoires, you need to start instrumentalizing them. So I think there is a kind of clarification process in the discipline and then pushing out into the environment, which will happen. And I think I'm convincing more and more colleagues. And there's a lot of interesting series. I mean, you have the fantastic Smart Geometry Conference. And it's everyone with great success to bring that institution and that workshop and that kind of one of the hubs of what I call parametricism. It's the technologically fabrication-oriented end of the research. But that's, in a sense, it's very important. I mean, I think that gathers momentum. That will be here as a resource. So I think there's still several components which need to be brought together, and I'm the kind of great synthesizer, if you like, in my own perspective. I'm pushing out, trying to build these projects, but I'm also trying to kind of bring everybody onto a collective project. It's the great invitation to participate. It's not wanting to promote myself, and I mean, I'm giving everything away. I give all my ideas to students all the time. I give credit to everybody. I mean, this is nothing. This is a collective project. We've kind of learned so much from all these other people, and we're not insisting on anything to be ours. I mean, that's a really misunderstanding.
There was a question up there. Go ahead.
As architecture becomes more global, as the entire economy, the world becomes more global, this sort of globalization. I was wondering, if you take a look at all the other epochs in architecture before, they're largely regulated to the Western civilization in Europe, and then maybe in modernism, in case it regulated stuff in both Europe and America. I was sort of wondering, when you see parametricism as an architectural movement, and as a new epoch in underdeveloped countries such as Africa or South America, and how it would begin to sort of manifest itself in a truly global world?
Very good question. I mean, it was when asked, is it relevant to something like kind of social housing? I think it does. Even the kind of, even those kind of projects which are maybe not high performance, high density, there's a need to there's more individualism required, there's need to differentiate the different family models and differentiating, and different cultures have different requirements. But the principles by which I kind of bring these requirements forth are universal. So I think what is important, this is not Western architecture, the latest Western style. That whole concept of Western has to be kind of cast aside. This is a global project, and global culture, and in fact world society, as Luhmann says. And I think there's a kind of really problematic to be hung up on using still these categories, Western, Eastern, particularly in a nation, a great nation like China. It gets in the way because I would believe Homi Bhabha and his concept that of an always already intricately hybridity of these cultures. Even the so-called Western culture is drawn from Arab culture, from Chinese culture. America is a kind of fusion and melting pot of cultures and strands of intelligences. I think that gets in the way, and gets in the way because it reasserts some kind of bizarre regionalism. So we're invited to we're doing projects in China, in central megalopolis, high performance hubs of culture, of commerce, of work. And they live and work in ways which are contemporary global best practice. I mean, they're learning, and the kind of attempt to try to kind of give Chinese character and demand of that is a kind of distraction, because there is this idea that there's somehow Western. It's nothing to do with Western. I mean, it is equally absurd to kind of to ask what is the kind of German version of parametricism. I'm German, and it means nothing in the contemporary world. So I think it's truly global and truly architecture is world architecture. Like there's world cinema, there's world literature, there's world, and there's even world design, there's world civilization, a world financial system, a world economy, a world political system, and a world science. That's so these regionalisms in terms of national identities and traditional ethnic or identities, they are really getting in the way.
Okay, I disagree.
Wrong ideology.
I disagree. First of all, I want to preface, I want to say one thing before I speak to the presentation. The credit to the Smart Geometry Conference should go to Dimitris Komodronis and Jefferson Ellinger. And we need to thank them for that. I just want to make sure the credits go to the right place. The second thing is, it's an astonishing, brave lecture, because you're both the subject and the object. You're both the author in the forefront in many ways, producing some of the most radically, morphologically complex, parametrically attuned projects in the 21st century, and yet at the same time you're trying to step out of that arena and develop a kind of a taxonomic frame by which to help you and your colleagues and the world at large read the production of this work. And it comes certainly with an enormous amount of complexity, difficulty, risk, and resistance. And I would, so I mean, I applaud you, because there are very few people with that kind of ambition. I certainly am sympathetic to those that are uncomfortable with assigning names to any movement, fully aware of the inadequacy of language. This is making me busy.
Sorry.
That portfolio is a little too intense.
Okay. I wanted to get to
So try to put me to sleep with the fast projects. So here you are trying to create a taxonomic system. I remember when Greg came out in the 90s with the word blob. I mean, on some level, he should be applauded because it rose to the top as an enabler for discourse to be promoted around an area of inquiry that was seriously problematized. Yet it was also at the same time misinterpreted by large populations of people. And I suppose a couple of qualifications before I go into with a comment. One is, I do think that whether or not everyone in the audience agrees with the totality and your belief system that this can find some elegant closure, that's to be debated. But the fact is there are a number of contributions that you cite both as methodological processes and certainly opportunities from an aesthetic, cultural, technological, environmental perspective that could utilize these processes in the most intelligent, sensitive way for our time. And I agree with that. So if you leave the frame for a moment and you go into a whole series of interiorities of your presentation, there's an enormous amount of opportunistic brilliance. Where I do disagree with you, and I thought that question was beautifully posited, because I think there's another paradox, and that is that you happen to be inside a practice that is so rarefied, it moves around the world seamlessly, and it's able to access capital, and I would even say power, to drive these most spectacular projects. But they become these colossal magnets as signature architecture. So the kind of provocation of that question was that might there be other orbits of cultural forces that are not where you stand in terms of where your projects reside and the impact they have, which is so rare because it's produced from the margin. I'm talking about, in a way, kind of radical avant-garde. Then it goes to the center because it becomes the ultimate institution and gets branded and appropriated by many other kind of delivery systems to do other forms of work. Yet the work that he's speaking to seems to me has a kind of a whole series of calibrated, in the spirit of the parametric, nuanced approaches which do not assert themselves as having the kind of same branded power. So where I disagree with you ideologically is I actually think the potential danger of both the process and the style, if it doesn't assume different orbit conditions, is that it will reaffirm in a weird way this kind of infinite smoothing of sameness, which is a kind of homogeneity, which is the danger of globalization. And I would argue that although this needs, your practice absolutely should be celebrated and needs to go forward, I actually think that there are other practices that constitute a constellation of resistance that is good for you, is good for all of us. And a case in point would be a number of your projects when you show the photos from the outside. They acquire, we spoke about this before, they acquire an enormous amount of power through the juxtaposition of the fabric, the existing fabric, however historically profound or banal. That difference to me needs to be sustained. And so this hegemonic enthusiasm that you have, I agree with it on an intellectual level, but I have to say that we have to be very careful that the kind of differentiation that you're talking about needs to be sustained through a whole range of different, both material and I would say even architectural practice types.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, how I would answer this, I just want to show you this picture here. And I showed you the animation in Istanbul. You have, I do believe two things. First of all, that as much as we are designing some of those special civic, cultural buildings like the National Museum for Contemporary Art and Architecture, like in Rome, they deserve to be a certain degree of singularity and focus on that, yet we still try to embed it into a texture and drawing. That's one thing, and I don't personally believe that it is, what interests me is not that kind of shock of the other and the kind of singularity of the event. For me, it's the interest in the principle and the universalization and of this. So it's the Seagram building. When it arrived in New York, in the late 50s, it lands like a kind of alien provocation from outer space in a kind of brownstone kind of world. And I think it would have been a fallacy to say, that's what I like about it. I only like that moment of rupture and otherness, which transports, yes, it's stimulating for an architect, and to see new potential. But in a sense, Mies was right, and his project was not that. His project was that influence that then rolls out and transforms Manhattan in its image. And that is the power, the true power of this contribution, and not arresting itself in the shock of the other. And I believe, another point, and I think the same is with our projects, and I can envisage a kind of continuous parametricist texture of urbanism, but of course the sedimentation of past centuries will be embedded within it. They will not be kind of wiped out. Gradually transformed, yes, but that's what we're trying to hear. We're kind of affiliating to existing structures and to textures and creating kind of a new synthesis which absorbs and translates and reveals and presents and makes navigable and prior even more fragmented urban textures. So this is not about tabula rasa, it's not the modernist project, tabula rasa project. It is a kind of inherently integrative, manipulative, in a positive sense project. So I think that, at least for me, is my sensibility, the way and I think it's also the sensibility which would give more importance to this work if it was just a kind of signature moment of a kind of escape and otherness. And now maybe I'm pushing it too far, but that's what I'm picking up from you. It would be not worth my while.
No, you're misinterpreting. So I am totally in support of the kind of infinite range of calibrated options available within the methodological techniques to respond to a range of influences away from itself. I'm not sure that your particular example that you just showed us is the best one to talk about a kind of beautiful reciprocity between certain cultural conditions that may have been around for 1,500 years and a 21st century urbanism that drops itself, other than an aerial map that speaks about a kind of scalar gradation. But the theory of
morphological affiliation, affiliation to textures, to materiality, to draw these things in, because these older textures need to start to work within a new life process. Now, and I think what I want to emphasize, there's a kind of, I think there's a romanticism, I feel, in your comment. Like, you're romanticizing the diversity of culture. There's a danger in your comment to romanticize the diversity of culture and of historical cultures, and the kind of demonization of what you can globalize and homogeneity. And I think there's a real problem here, because it's a kind of, the world as zoo, as preservation. That's the kind of, the logic of, well, maybe I'm just putting that out there, and I'm saying, I'm celebrating also the fact that we have at the AADRL students from India, from Africa, from Russia, from Eastern Europe, from China, and so on, and they come into a kind of global discourse and culture which is specific to a 25-year-old, design-oriented, ambitious students, and that's the culture which is different from the kind of Wall Street, let's say, and different from yet the sciences, the engineering and sciences kind of discourse. These are the diverse cultures, but each of them is a global culture. It is absolutely irrelevant whether that scientist operates in India or in Germany or Shanghai, that's kind of marginal. So I celebrate this kind of diversity in the World Division of Labor, at the same time the kind of capacity to communicate still across otherwise fetishized traditional cultures. And I don't believe, I think what is an anachronism to be overcome is the kind of division of the world into nation states and what is getting away of establishing a true world society, which exists on the level of these function systems. There's a world science, there's a world architecture, there's a world economy, there's a world art system, and these nationalities. I think that's I think what I picked up there. So you know which kind of cultures I cherish, and they're real and effective and deepening, and those cultures which are kind of reminiscent, which are cast aside.
Patrick,
Yeah.
Albert Alto
Yeah.
was a modernist, but you can find in both the detailing and the plans and sections of his buildings truly a Finnish ethos. I don't know how else to put it. It's not romanticizing. It's one that appreciates cultural memory and believes that you can move forward into the 22nd century and sustain difference, which is your argument. That's your argument.
It's not this kind of difference.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that although there's an enormous amount of affinity, of great profundity between your theoretical position and your architectural practice, which I gotta say,
Look, I can ask you, I have to interrupt you. What are we a kind of a Finnish, are we an Iraqi firm, a British firm? I mean, what are we? I mean, it's a different era, but also I think modernism was a truly global world architecture. Le Corbusier was the great protagonist of working in South America, working in Moscow, working in Africa, working in Europe, working in America. Now, is Corbusier a French architect? What kind of tried claptrap is that? And I'm in his, we are making the next step. If Corbusier was neither French nor American nor anything else, why should we ever be?
Patrick, I don't see these things as diametrically opposed. I'm just within the logic of your argument. The system has the capacity to evolve and index a variety of difference. All we're saying here is that it's a very important argument at a time of globalization, right? Where with the wrong authors in a position of power, certainly the world can become more homogeneous and difference can be lost. I'm not suggesting that you subscribe to that, but there's 300 students in this room who need to be able to understand the ethic of projects as well. And with that, we thank you very much.
Okay, the next time I will discuss ethics and morality of architecture. I will not give you that last word.